I kept telling myself I had made a mistake by coming here tonight, but I came anyway. The Magnolia room smelled like money and Christmas trees and polished silverware I could not afford. Around me, couples laughed over wine and desserts that cost more than my weekly groceries. I sat alone at table 7, staring at the empty chair across from me and pretending not to care. My friend Tyler had begged me to show up for this blind date with his cousin, swearing it would help. He said a few months of hiding from the world were enough, as if grief had an expiration date. He did not live the night. I walked in and found my girlfriend Emma with my business partner Derek. In one 30-second scene, I lost the woman I loved, the future of my company, and my own certainty. Since then, dates felt like a cruel joke, and fancy restaurants like this felt like someone else's life. I had no idea that before the night ended I would be on one knee in front of my ex's mother. If you want to know how a simple attempt to help turned into the wildest decision of my life, stay with me until the end. This is the story of how a fake proposal in a crowded restaurant slowly became the most real thing I have ever felt. Of how humiliation, grief, and one reckless act collided to change not just one future, but two broken hearts at once. And before we step into that moment when everything shifted, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That way you will not miss any of the emotional stories and second chances we share here every single week. Now, picture it again with me. A fancy dining room, a late blind date, and a man who was ready to run away. A single glance across the room stopped me in my tracks and forced me to confront a past I thought was finished. Because at another table, in a navy dress and with trembling hands, sat someone I once called family. The last person I expected to find alone on a blind date, and the last person I ever thought I would propose to. And everything that followed began with the simple choice not to look away when her world started to crumble. The night had started like a favor I regretted agreeing to before I even sat down at table 7. Tyler had texted me all week with encouragements, memes, and threats until I finally said yes. According to him, a blind date with his cousin would be the perfect way to stop grieving my past. In his mind, 2 years after a betrayal was more than enough time to return to something normal. In my mind, 2 years were barely enough to accept that the life I planned no longer existed. The Magnolia room looked like the kind of place for people whose lives never suddenly collapse. White tablecloths glowed under soft light. Candles flickered next to bottles of expensive wine. I checked the menu and quickly decided that water and a single drink was all I could responsibly buy. My date was now almost 20 minutes late, and each passing minute made the chair opposite heavier. I was seconds away from inventing a work emergency and disappearing before anyone noticed I was alone. I swirled the whiskey in my glass without drinking, watching the amber circle like time in slow motion. 2 years earlier, I would have ordered dessert, joked with the waiter, and talked about business plans. Back then, Derek and I were partners. Emma and I were supposedly solid, and everything seemed upward. That illusion shattered in the storage closet of our office at the Christmas party, bodies and guilt exposed. That image still visited me at night, not only because of the betrayal, but because of how small I felt. Since then, I had become an expert at avoiding rooms full of happy couples and overpriced wine. Yet here I was, honoring a promise to a friend who did not understand the weight of memory. Tyler believed I only needed a good night to reset, as if heartbreak were a software glitch. I tried to convince myself he might be right, that a new story could start in a place like this. But my chest tightened with every laugh from nearby tables, reminding me how far I felt from belonging. I forced myself to look around so I would not stare at my silent phone or the door every few seconds. The restaurant was busy, servers weaving between tables like dancers with plates held carefully high. Most faces were unfamiliar, softened by candlelight and the comfort of knowing they were not alone. Then, 3 tables away, at table 12, my eyes caught a profile I knew too well to misinterpret. A woman in a navy dress sat alone, back straight, but shoulders slightly folded inward toward her screen. At first I thought my mind was playing a trick, dragging ghosts from the past into this polished room. But when she lifted her head and adjusted a strand of hair behind her ear, the doubt vanished instantly. It was Margaret Hayes, the woman who had once called me family when Emma and I were together. For a moment, I forgot my own date, my own history, everything but the quiet sadness on her face. And something in me leaned toward her instinctively, long before I ever moved my body from my chair. Memories of dinner at her old house flickered in my mind like scenes from another lifetime entirely. I remembered pots of soup at Christmas when I had the flu and she insisted I should not be alone. I remembered the way she stocked sweet tea because I once mentioned it reminded me of my grandmother. I remembered her defending my coffee shop dreams when Emma's father mocked them across the table. Margaret had always been the one steady, kind presence in a family that did not quite know what to do with me. Seeing her now, smaller somehow in that expensive chair, felt like watching a painting fade in real time. It was obvious she was waiting for someone, checking her phone, forcing composure that cracked at the edges. I could not yet imagine what would happen next, only that the sight of her alone disturbed me deeply. My blind date had already disappeared from my priorities. I did not even know if I wanted her to come. The real story of that night was quietly unfolding at table 12, and I was already part of it whether I liked it or not. While I debated whether to walk over and say hello or pretend I had not seen her, a waiter appeared. He carried a chilled bottle of champagne and wore the proud smile of someone delivering good news. His voice cut through the murmur of the room as he stopped at Margaret's table with theatrical flair. "Compliments of your date, ma'am," he announced, loud enough for at least 4 tables to hear clearly. Margaret blinked up at him, confusion clouding her features, then glanced down at her phone again. Even from where I sat, I saw the exact moment her expression shifted from puzzled to quietly devastated. Her lips parted as if she might still hope for an explanation, then pressed into a thin, determined line. "He's not coming," she said, the words fragile and small against the polished clatter of the restaurant. She reached for her purse, shoulders shrinking as if she could fold herself away from everyone's eyes. The waiter's apology came out awkwardly loud, broadcasting her rejection instead of cushioning it. That sentence, that overacted apology, turned the whole incident into a spectacle in less than a breath. Nearby diners turned their heads with the casual cruelty of people grateful not to be the ones on display. Some tried to look discreet, stealing glances behind wine glasses and menus that did not hide their interest. Others simply stared, whispering over folded hands as if narrating her humiliation for each other's benefit. I saw a woman shake her head with exaggerated pity, and an older man roll his eyes and shrug dismissively. Margaret's fingers trembled while she counted bills, carefully avoiding eye contact with the growing audience. I remembered what Emma had told me near the end of our relationship, half confession, half weapon. Her mother had finalized a grueling divorce, lost the house she loved, and shed weight she never meant to lose. Emma had accused me of not understanding what real heartbreak looked like, waving Margaret's pain like proof. Watching her now, crumbling quietly under the weight of strangers' judgment, I finally understood every word. It was more than a bad date. It was a public verdict on her worth, delivered by silence and stares. I felt anger burn up through my chest, hot and sharp, aimed at Robert whatever his name was, and everyone watching. Margaret had shown me kindness when she had nothing to gain, treating me like a son when I felt disposable. She brought soup when I was sick, remembered my tiny preferences, and defended my ambitions at family dinners. She once told me I reminded her of her younger brother who had died when she was very young, gentle and stubborn. That memory rose up now, mixing with the sight of her hunched shoulders and trembling hands at table 12. My own drink remained untouched as the ice melted slowly, mirroring the resolve solidifying inside my ribs. I knew I could stay seated and tell myself it was not my business, that we were practically strangers now. But doing nothing felt like betrayal layered on betrayal, a cowardice I would not be able to forget. I realized I cared far more about what was happening to her than about any blind date I might ruin forever. My hand moved toward my wallet almost before I consciously decided on a plan, fingers acting on instinct. Tucked behind an expired gym membership card was my grandmother's ring, cool metal against my skin. It was white gold with a modest stone, more sentiment than market value, but priceless to me nonetheless. She had left it with a handwritten note saying, "Give this to someone who makes you believe in magic again." For 3 years I had carried it without knowing who that someone might be or when the moment would arrive. I never pictured myself using it in a crowded restaurant to rescue my ex's mother from a humiliating evening. Yet the idea that formed in my mind would not let go, outrageous and irrational and somehow inevitable. It would mean lying in front of dozens of people and tying myself to a story we could not easily undo. It might reach Emma, might reach the entire city, might become something much bigger than one awkward dinner. But as Margaret stood to leave with her dignity fraying, I knew I would regret staying seated far more than acting. Margaret was slipping her wallet back into her purse when I crossed the room and slid into the chair across from her. For a heartbeat, she stared at me like I was a hallucination, as if grief and shock had conjured my face. "Jason," she whispered, my name breaking in the middle like something fragile that had been stored away. We had not been in the same room since Emma and I detonated our relationship and disappeared from each other. Her eyes searched mine, desperate for an explanation that did not yet exist in any sensible language. Before she could speak again, I leaned forward and let my voice carry just enough to reach nearby tables. "I am so sorry I'm late. Traffic from downtown was insane," I said, like a man arriving for his own date. Several heads turned immediately, curiosity flaring as the narrative rewrote itself in their minds. Margaret blinked twice, confusion and alarm battling in her features while she fought to keep composure. "Jason, you are not my date," she hissed under her breath, barely moving her lips around the words. "I was supposed to meet someone named Robert from my book club. We planned this for weeks," she added sharply. Her voice shook and I could feel the thin thread holding her together, straining under too much pressure. Inside my chest, every alarm bell was ringing, but my body had already committed to the path I had chosen. I took her hand gently, more for the audience than for her, yet unable to ignore the tremor in her fingers. "I know this makes no sense right now," I said, still speaking louder than a private conversation required. "But I promise in a minute it is going to be a little less confusing, if you can trust me for just one moment." Her gaze flicked around the room, taking in the phones, the stairs, the people already building a story. People were not just watching anymore. They were waiting for the next scene, the next line, the next twist. "Jason, what are you doing?" she whispered, each word weighted with panic and restrained outrage. Instead of answering, I stood so fast that my chair scraped across the hardwood floor with a piercing screech. The sudden noise snapped the room into attention, conversations fading into a heavy, expectant silence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped back from the table and dropped to one knee on the floor. The hardwood felt cold even through my slacks, the kind of detail I would remember long after this night. I pulled my grandmother's ring from my pocket, the diamond catching the soft light like it knew its role. Gasps rippled outward as people realized what they were seeing, phones rising like a forest around us. Margaret's eyes widened, shifting from confusion to shock, and then to a kind of frozen disbelief. "Oh my God, what are you doing?" she asked in a broken whisper meant only for me, not for our audience. "I am trying to save you," I murmured back, barely moving my lips, hands shaking just enough to betray me. "Please, just go with it. I will explain everything later. I just cannot let them remember you like this." Then I raised my head and my voice, turning my words toward every stranger who now held our story in their hands. "Margaret Hayes," I began, letting the name hang in the air like the first note of a song people knew. "I have been planning this evening for weeks, wanting every detail to be perfect for you and only you. Sitting here tonight, I realize perfection means nothing compared to the thought of losing another day without you." Her hands shook visibly now, eyes darting between the ring, my face and the circle of onlookers recording us. "Jason, this is insane. My daughter is your ex-girlfriend," she whispered, panic cracking every syllable open. "I know," I answered softly. "And this will probably haunt us later, but right now I just want to give you a way out. Say yes, and we can figure out the rest later, or say no and walk away with every eye on your back again." I watched her throat move as she swallowed, watched the fight between fear and self-preservation play out silently. For several seconds, the entire restaurant held its breath, waiting for a single word that could shatter everything. "Yes," she finally said, unsteady and stunned, and the room erupted like a celebration scene in someone else's movie. Applause crashed over us from every direction, a wave of sound that felt far bigger than the room itself. People pounded on tables, whistled, shouted congratulations as if they had been rooting for us all along. Someone yelled for the waiter to pop the champagne, and he obliged with theatrical delight and a loud cork. Foam spilled into flutes while strangers raised their glasses toward us like they had known us for years. A woman hurried over asking to take our picture, insisting it was the most romantic thing she had ever seen. Margaret smiled for the camera because there was nothing else she could reasonably do in that moment. I slid the ring onto her finger, breath catching when it fit as if it had been measured for her hand alone. It felt like a sign from my grandmother or fate or some mischievous universe we did not understand. I pulled Margaret into a hug partly to complete the scene, partly because she looked like she might faint. "I am so sorry," I whispered against her ear, hoping the noise of the room would swallow my confession. "I know this is insane. I know you did not ask for it, but I could not watch them tear you apart like that," I added. Her arms slowly came around me, not in passion, but in a controlled embrace meant for the cameras and bystanders. "You just proposed to your ex-girlfriend's mother in front of half the city," she murmured without moving her lips much. "Emma is going to go nuclear when she finds out, and I am not sure she will be wrong to be angry." "I was not thinking about Emma," I admitted, pulling back enough to search her eyes for any sign of total hatred. "I was thinking about you, and about a room full of people who were ready to remember you only as the woman who got stood up." The waiter set 2 glasses of champagne in front of us, grinning so widely it seemed to hurt his cheeks. "Congratulations again, you too," he said, already turning to another table to retell our story in his own words. We finally managed to sit down, both of us holding the delicate stems like anchors in a storm we had created. For several moments we just breathed, listening to the buzz of conversation that now centered on our table. Margaret stared at the ring on her finger as if it might suddenly tighten or explode or vanish in thin air. "Explain," she said at last, her tone low and controlled, the tone of a woman choosing calm over collapse. I told her everything in a rush, how I had watched the waiter humiliate her and the diners turn her into gossip. I described the anger that surged through me, the way the ring in my wallet had felt like a dare I could not ignore. I admitted I had not thought beyond the next 10 minutes, had not calculated consequences or public reaction. For a long beat, she was silent, pushing the base of her glass slowly in a small circle on the tablecloth. "Do you realize this will not stay in this room?" she finally asked, eyes flicking toward the raised phones. "Those videos are already online somewhere, being watched by people who do not care about context. By tomorrow, everyone from my book club to your old coworkers could have seen you on your knee." There was no way to argue with that, no version of the night where this remained a private misstep. "If we backtrack tomorrow and say it was all a joke, I look like a gullible fool twice," she continued quietly. "First as the woman who was left alone at a table, then as the woman who agreed to help you pull off a stunt." She was not wrong. Trying to erase the narrative would only smear us both with ridicule and suspicion. At the same time, letting it stand unchallenged meant committing to a future we had not discussed at all. "We could tell the truth later," I suggested, feeling the weight of every angle we had yet to examine. "We could say it started as something impulsive and evolved into something more complicated than we expected." Margaret sighed, tired in a way that came from more than one difficult night, more than one hard year. "The problem is that the story already has a life of its own," she said, glancing at another glowing screen. "Whatever we decide next, we are already characters in a tale people are desperate to share. Neither of us knew it then, but that improvised proposal had just tied our lives together far beyond one dinner." The next morning my phone buzzed with such intensity that I woke convinced something terrible had happened. When I saw Margaret's name on the screen alongside dozens of notifications, I realized something had happened indeed. I hurried to Riverside Coffee, my small shop by the river, and found her already sitting by the front window. She looked different without the navy dress and soft lighting, more like herself and yet more exposed somehow. Her phone lay on the table between us, paused on the video of our proposal with a staggering view count underneath. More than 2 million people had watched us in less than 12 hours, the number climbing with every refresh. I slid into the seat across from her and stared at the screen, suddenly aware of how public our lives had become. Margaret scrolled through her messages, the endless stream of calls, voicemails and emails making her shoulders tense. "Diana called 6 times before I even woke up," she said, naming one of her closest friends from the museum. "She wants to throw us an engagement party next weekend and says I am not allowed to say no this time." She showed me a text from Tyler, full of exclamation marks and heart emojis, congratulating us like he had planned it. Then she opened an email from a local morning show inviting us to share our romantic Christmas proposal on live television. They wanted to film us back at the Magnolia Room, reenact key moments, and talk about finding love after hard seasons. My stomach twisted as I read their cheerful invitation, understanding how quickly a single video can become a brand. Meanwhile, my own phone was full of messages from friends, customers, and my business partner demanding explanations. People who had not spoken to me in years suddenly cared deeply about my relationship status and emotional journey. The shop door chimed periodically with early customers, some already glancing between me and Margaret with curiosity. We sat there surrounded by the smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries, yet our mouths tasted only of worry. For a few minutes, we scrolled in silence, trying to grasp the scale of what had escaped our control overnight. When we finally looked up at each other, it was with the unspoken agreement that pretending this was small was impossible. "We have two real options," I said quietly, even though no one else was close enough to overhear our table. "We can come clean now and tell everyone it was spontaneous, that you were stood up and I overreacted trying to help. That version will make me look reckless and possibly unhinged, and it will show you as someone needing rescue twice. Or we keep this story alive for a few weeks, let the chaos calm down, and then end things gently in the new year." In that version, we would announce that we moved too fast, that the relationship did not work without public drama. Margaret twisted the ring slowly around her finger, eyes fixed on the surface of the table like it contained answers. She could have taken it off in the night, placed it on a dresser and refused to touch it again, but she had not. "If we tell the truth now, I become a tragic anecdote instead of someone who got a wild, beautiful moment," she said. "If we keep pretending, we are tying ourselves to a lie that will involve our families and Emma and half the city." Neither path was clean, and both came with a cost we would be paying long after the comments stopped arriving. After a long silence, I suggested what felt like the least harmful version of two bad plans and watched her consider it. "What if we set a deadline on the lie?" I asked, tracing a circle on the wooden tabletop with my fingertip. "We stay engaged through the holidays, through Christmas and New Year's, and then we end it quietly in January. No big announcement, no scandal, just a simple story about two people who realized they were not meant to last." Margaret looked out the window at the empty street, the decorations hanging in shop windows like hopeful promises. 3 weeks, she repeated slowly, as if tasting the time frame on her tongue to see if it was bearable. 3 weeks of pretending to be engaged to my daughter's ex-boyfriend in front of everyone we know. I smiled weakly and offered my hand across the table like I was sealing a business deal instead of a life twist. 3 weeks of being engaged to my ex-girlfriend's mother, I answered, trying to find humor in the absurdity. She actually laughed, a small genuine sound, and when her hand closed around mine, the pact became real. The first days of our 3-week engagement felt like walking across thin ice that might crack at any step. We politely declined most television and newspaper invitations, answering with careful, rehearsed emails. Neither of us wanted to become professional storytellers of a moment that had already spiraled beyond reason. Still, the video continued to spread, and the comments multiplied, painting us as a fairy tale couple of December. For strangers, we were proof that love could appear out of nowhere and turn humiliation into magic overnight. For us, we were two people trying to remember which parts of our growing legend were real and which were scripted. Friends invited us to small gatherings, eager to hear the famous proposal story directly from our mouths. At those parties, we retold the softened version, skipping the panic, highlighting the tenderness and stunned joy. Each time we repeated it, the narrative smoothed a little, less jagged and more like a scene from a film. But afterward, when the door closed and the room went quiet, the weight of the performance settled on our shoulders. As we coordinated schedules and outfits, our messages gradually drifted into topics that had nothing to do with appearances. She sent me photos of new exhibits at the museum where she worked, along with little anecdotes about the artists. I replied with stories from the coffee shop, talking about regulars, strange orders, and the constant worry over rent. Logistical texts about who would drive to which dinner turned into late-night conversations about sleeplessness and fear. I learned that Margaret spent many nights scrolling through real estate listings she could no longer afford to enter. She learned that guilt kept me awake, replaying the night of the betrayal and wondering what signs I had missed. What started as a fake engagement script slowly shifted into two lives genuinely intertwining, line by improvised line. There were moments at gatherings when her hand found mine automatically for show and then simply stayed there. Moments when her laughter came so freely that I forgot we were supposed to be pretending to be in love. The line between protecting each other and actually belonging to each other blurred until it was hard to see. Then came December 23rd, a date I always observed quietly with flowers in my grandmother's memory. That morning I drove to Oakwood Cemetery, carrying coffee and a small bouquet, expecting only solitude and silence. I stood by my grandmother's grave, telling her out loud about the chaos of the last weeks like I always narrated my life. I told her about Margaret, about the ring she had left me, about how things had become both impossible and strangely right. My voice dropped when I admitted I did not know whether this was temporary or the beginning of something permanent. Footsteps on the gravel behind me made me turn, and there was Margaret, holding flowers, framed by cold winter light. She stopped, clearly surprised to see me, then glanced toward the maple tree on the hill behind my grandmother's plot. "My mom is buried just over there," she said softly, as if that explained everything about our shared presence. She told me she visited every year on the same day, carrying her own mixture of grief and gratitude to that hill. In an instant, our fake relationship faded, leaving just two people sitting with their losses in the same quiet place. We ended up sitting side by side on the damp grass, coats pulled tight, the cold settling into our bones. For a while we barely spoke, each lost in thoughts of the women who had shaped us and then left us behind. Eventually the stories began, small at first, then richer, as if we were introducing our families to each other. I told Margaret how my grandmother had worked 2 jobs without ever letting me feel like a burden on her shoulders. She talked about Eleanor, her mother, who always knew when something was wrong even if no one said a word. Eleanor had taught her to bake, to pay attention to details, and to judge people by what they did when nobody watched. As she said that, I thought of the ring again, of the proposal, of the bizarre but earnest attempt to shield her from shame. In that cemetery, the gesture no longer felt like some wild stunt, but a clumsy extension of values handed down to us. When the cold finally forced us to move, she asked if I wanted to get lunch, saying neither of us should be alone that day. I said yes without thinking, and that simple answer marked the start of something we were no longer faking. We found a small diner called Pete's Place, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and pancakes forever. The vinyl seats were cracked, the chrome was scratched, but the warmth inside felt more honest than any white tablecloth. We slid into a corner booth, and for the first time since the proposal, it felt like we could speak without performing. Between bites of burgers and fries, the conversation drifted away from small talk into territory we had both avoided. Margaret asked about the partnership I had left behind, saying Emma always insisted Derek and I were perfect together. I stared at the ketchup bottle for a moment, then decided I was done protecting people who had never protected me. I told her about that office Christmas party, about the supply closet, about walking in on the two of them together. The words came out flat and quiet, stripped of drama, leaving only the raw facts and the ache that still followed me. Margaret's face tightened with shock, then anger, then a deep sadness that was not for herself, but for me. She told me you grew apart, that it was mutual, she said, voice low, as if ashamed of her own ignorance. I shrugged, a gesture that tried to dismiss the weight of that night, but failed somewhere halfway through. Emma is good at rewriting history, so it hurts a little less for her, and a lot more for everyone else, I said honestly. I admitted that part of me had always wondered whether Margaret believed the sanitized version and quietly blamed me. She shook her head sharply, eyes bright, saying she was sorry for not reaching out after everything fell apart. I wanted to call you so many times, she confessed, but I felt like it would be betraying my daughter if I did. Her guilt was unnecessary, yet painfully human, and I realized we had both spent 2 years walking on broken glass. In that booth, our roles as mother of the ex and ex-boyfriend dissolved, leaving only 2 wounded adults being honest. She did not defend Emma or try to excuse what had happened. She simply acknowledged my hurt and apologized anyway. The sincerity in her voice wrapped around a part of me that had stayed frozen since the night of the betrayal. By the time we stepped back out into the cold, an invisible line had been crossed from polite distance into quiet alliance. Christmas approached faster than we expected, and with it came obligations we could not gracefully avoid forever. A few days before Christmas Eve, Margaret called to say her sister Rebecca wanted me at dinner and was deeply suspicious. Rebecca, she warned, had a talent for smelling lies and an even greater talent for confronting people about them. The idea of sitting across from another watchful family member made the knot in my stomach return full force. Still, refusing the invitation would only make things worse, feeding the narrative that our engagement was hollow. So I agreed, promising to arrive on time with a bottle of wine and answers as ready as I could make them. On Christmas Eve, I stood on Margaret's doorstep, rehearsing our official story-like lines before a difficult scene. Rebecca opened the door with her arms crossed, scanning me as if I carried a confession in my posture. "So this is the man who got engaged to my sister after one date," she said, not bothering to hide her skepticism. "I am still deciding whether that is fate or complete insanity," she added, stepping aside just enough to let me enter. The dining room was warm and decorated, the table laid with care, as if trying to anchor the night in tradition. During dinner, Rebecca fired questions between bites, each framed as casual conversation but sharp beneath the surface. She wanted to know how we reconnected, why things had moved so fast, what exactly I thought I could offer Margaret. I kept to the script Margaret and I had built, speaking of chance encounters and unexpected conversations that grew. Margaret helped, reminding her sister how kind I had been years ago, how I had shown up when her family needed help. But even as we spoke, I knew Rebecca was measuring not just my words, but how we looked at each other between sentences. Later, when Margaret left the room to fetch dessert, Rebecca cornered me in the kitchen near the humming refrigerator. She said Margaret had been lonely for a long time and that she would not hesitate to make my life miserable if I hurt her. I met her eyes and told her I was not playing games, that whatever this was, I was taking it seriously now. She studied me for a long breath, then nodded once, the closest thing to a temporary truce I could have hoped for. When we returned to the dining room, Margaret glanced between us, clearly suspecting her sister had said something blunt. "Just laying down some ground rules," I told her with a small smile, not wanting to add tension to the evening. Rebecca rolled her eyes, but did not contradict me, which for her probably counted as a ringing endorsement. Dinner continued with stories from their childhood, inside jokes, and the natural chaos of a family holiday. Several times Margaret reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it briefly before letting go again. I could feel how much courage it took for her to show any affection in front of a sister still unconvinced. Later, as I slipped on my coat by the door, she thanked me quietly for coming and for handling Rebecca with grace. She said she knew this was not the version of Christmas either of us had imagined a few months earlier. Yet there was something undeniably right about not facing it alone, even if the circumstances were strange. Walking back to my car that night, I realized I did not dread the next time I would see her. I looked forward to it. My plan for Christmas Day had been simple and bleak: close the shop, ignore the holiday, and count inventory alone. But at 8 in the morning there was a knock on my apartment door, loud and insistent enough to ruin that plan. When I opened it, Margaret stood there in a wool coat, cheeks pink from the cold, holding a bakery bag and 2 coffees. "You should not spend Christmas by yourself," she said, as if it were an obvious rule of the universe. "We may be engaged by accident, but we are at least friends on purpose, and friends do not leave each other alone today." There was no point arguing with that kind of logic, so I stepped aside and let her bring warmth into my small space. We spent the morning watching old movies on my worn-out couch, trading commentary like we had done it for years. At some point the distance between us vanished, not dramatically, just a steady inching closer until shoulders touched. The quiet companionship felt more healing than any carefully planned celebration could have offered. For the first time in a long while, Christmas did not feel like a day I had to endure. It felt almost like a gift. As snow threatened outside but never quite arrived, the conversation drifted into more vulnerable territory again. She asked about my parents, and I told her about the accident, about my grandmother stepping in without hesitation. I admitted I still felt guilty for having lived when they had not, even though I had been too young to understand. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression full of the same quiet attention she had given me years before. Then she shared pieces of her own story with Thomas, the husband who had left after 25 years of marriage. She described the day he announced he was starting a new life with someone younger, as if their history were disposable. That betrayal had cracked something deep inside, convincing her that certain kinds of love came with an expiration date. As she spoke, I realized how much loneliness she carried, even when surrounded by friends and colleagues. Our strange arrangement had given both of us an excuse to stop pretending we were perfectly fine alone. By the time she left that evening, the engagement felt less like a costume and more like a shape our hearts were growing into. Of course, life rarely allows quiet progress for long, especially when unresolved pasts are involved. 3 days after Christmas, the front door of Riverside Coffee flew open with enough force to rattle the bells. Emma walked in with her phone clutched in one hand and the fury of someone who has rehearsed an argument. She did not bother with hello or pleasantries, just slammed her phone on the counter so the screen faced me. Our proposal video played on loop, surrounded by headlines and comments, our frozen faces still on one knee and one gasp. "You are dating my mother," she shouted, the word mother landing like a thrown stone in the middle of the shop. The customers fell silent, their half-finished orders suddenly a background detail to a new drama unfolding live. I felt every eye on us as she accused me of being vengeful, of using Margaret to punish her for what she had done. Before I could respond, the bell chimed again and Margaret stepped inside, carrying a box of pastries and no idea what waited. In that instant, all the separate pieces of my life collided in the smallest, most fragile space I owned. Emma spun toward her mother the moment Margaret crossed the threshold, outrage flaring brighter than embarrassment. "Mom, what are you thinking?" she demanded, gesturing wildly between the two of us as if connecting invisible lines. "He is my ex-boyfriend. Do you understand how twisted this looks? How people are talking about you already?" Margaret set the pastry box down so carefully it was like watching someone handle explosives instead of croissants. She took a breath, lifting her chin with a steadiness I had not seen from her on the night of the proposal. "I am thinking that I am 52 years old and am allowed to decide who I spend my time with," she replied. Emma laughed, but the sound was sharp and humorless, full of hurt disguised as superiority. She accused her mother of looking desperate, of clinging to someone half her age just to feel desired again. I stepped forward then, unwilling to let Margaret stand alone in the center of that storm any longer. "This is not about you," I told Emma quietly, though my voice did not hide how tired I was of her assumptions. She insisted everything was about her, that I must be doing this only to get revenge for the affair she still downplayed. Emma said I was using her mother as collateral damage, that I was trying to steal Margaret just to make a point. Before I could answer, Margaret's voice cut through the tension with surprising sharpness and unshaken clarity. "I am not something that can be stolen," she said, eyes locked on her daughter's, daring her to argue with that. She reminded Emma that their relationship as mother and daughter did not give her veto power over her happiness. Emma's face flushed deeper, and she pulled out her phone as if it were a weapon she could finally use decisively. "Fine," she snapped. "Then I will tell everyone the truth about your little romantic moment at the restaurant." She threatened to post that the proposal had been fake, that I had humiliated Margaret with a staged act for attention. My stomach clenched, because if she told that story first, the world would see only manipulation and foolishness. Before panic could fully rise, Margaret stepped closer to her daughter, grounding herself with a calm that amazed me. "Go ahead and tell them," she said, not raising her voice, but giving each word enough weight to land hard. "Tell them Jason watched me being stood up and decided he could not bear to see me humiliated in front of everyone. Tell them we planned to pretend for a few weeks and then quietly drift apart, but somehow ended up really falling in love." Emma stared at her as if she had grown a second head, stunned that her mother would admit the lie and claim the truth at once. Margaret did not look away, even as pain flickered across her features at the thought of losing her daughter's approval. "What we have now is real," she continued, "and it is the most honest thing I have felt since your father left me. I am not going to apologize for that, even if people judge us, even if it takes you time to understand." Emma's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, and for a second I saw the scared version of her beneath the anger. She muttered that we deserved each other, tossed out one last warning, and stormed out, the bell jangling in her wake. The coffee shop slowly exhaled with her departure, leaving behind stunned customers and two people shaken but standing together. That night, Margaret and I sat on my couch with my laptop between us, both still shaken from the confrontation. We knew Emma would not let the matter rest quietly, and that rumors would spread faster than any correction. So we did the only thing that felt remotely honest in a situation built on half-truths and frantic improvisation. We decided to tell the full story ourselves, from the first painful moment at the restaurant to the very last choice. We recorded a video side by side, hands clasped tightly out of frame, voices trembling but refusing to hide. I explained how I had seen her, how the pity and judgment in the room had ignited something reckless inside me. I admitted the proposal had begun as a rescue mission, a misguided attempt to give her back some dignity and control. Margaret spoke about her divorce, about years of loneliness, about how she had convinced herself she was done with love. She told the world that somewhere between the lie and the act, real affection had taken root in unexpected soil. When we finished, we uploaded the video, turned off our phones, and tried to sleep, unsure whether we had just saved ourselves or made everything worse. The next morning our phones buzzed so violently they nearly fell off the nightstands and onto the floor. When we finally gathered the courage to look, hundreds of notifications flooded the screens all at once. Bracing for cruelty, we opened the comments and were stunned to find message after message filled with kindness instead. People called our story messy and beautiful, saying it felt more real because it had not started perfectly. Some wrote that love at any age was worth fighting for, that second chances often came wearing strange disguises. Others admitted they had judged us harshly until hearing the full truth, then apologized for their assumptions. At the shop, customers came in specifically to meet us, buying extra coffee just to support my struggling business. The online fundraiser page for Riverside Coffee jumped from 22,000 to 41,000 in 2 days. One older woman hugged Margaret with tears in her eyes, saying our story made her believe dating again might not be ridiculous. For a brief stretch of days, it seemed honesty had turned our disaster into a lifeline not only for us, but for others too. Of course, not everyone celebrated our choice, and the wave of support soon met a churning undercurrent of disapproval. Emma began posting long updates about how I had manipulated her mother and taken advantage of a midlife crisis. She shared old photos of us as a couple, captioning them with barbed remarks about what used to be normal. A few of Margaret's relatives, including her cousin Linda, called to say people would always see our relationship as wrong. Their voices joined Emma's in her head, echoing late into the night when she tried and failed to fall asleep. For 3 days she scrolled endlessly through social media, absorbing every harsh word like another invisible bruise. Her appetite vanished, and the bright, grounded woman I knew began to look smaller and more uncertain again. Early one morning, I found her sitting alone in her car outside the coffee shop, hands clenched around the steering wheel. Her eyes were red and tired, full of questions she had not yet spoken aloud to anyone, including herself. "I do not know if I can keep doing this," she confessed as I slid into the passenger seat, closing the door softly behind me. I asked her the only question that mattered under all the noise, stripping everything else away until just one truth remained. "Do you love me?" I said, the words feeling both terrifying and strangely simple after everything we had confessed already. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time there was no hesitation as she nodded and whispered, "You know I do." I took her hand and reminded her of her own wisdom, words she had once given me at Emma's birthday dinner years ago. I told her she was the one who had warned me not to set myself on fire, just to keep everyone else warm and comfortable. "We cannot build our lives around Emma's anger or Linda's judgment," I said, squeezing her fingers to anchor us both. "They are allowed to feel however they feel, but they do not get to vote on your happiness or define mine." We sat there in the growing light, the dashboard casting soft shadows as the city slowly woke around us. Finally, she wiped her cheeks, inhaled deeply, and said, "Then let us do this for real and stop apologizing for it." In that car, our relationship shifted from a complicated defense to an intentional choice we were both willing to protect. From that day forward, we stopped hiding, posting photos without overthinking, writing honestly about love after 50. Strangers responded with their own stories of unconventional relationships, of age gaps, and blended histories that worked. 3 weeks later, Rebecca called to say Emma wanted to talk and was ready, at least, to stop fighting every step. They met without me, and Margaret later told me Emma had cried, admitting she felt left behind, not truly betrayed. She said Emma was not ready to celebrate us yet, but she did not want to lose her mother over her own hurt pride. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was a fragile bridge, and for Margaret, that counted as a small miracle. 4 months after our first, chaotic proposal, I closed the coffee shop early and filled it with candles and flowers. I stood in my best suit by the front window, holding the same ring that had once been an improvisation and a shield. When Margaret walked in expecting inventory, I dropped to one knee and asked her to marry me with no audience and no act. This time her yes came fast, clear and joyful, and there was nothing fake about the way our hands shook as the ring found its home. Looking back, I still cannot pinpoint the exact moment when our performance stopped being a performance at all. It was not the standing ovation at the Magnolia Room or the millions of views on a shaky proposal video. It was not even the carefully crafted confession we uploaded late at night with our phones turned face down. I think it happened slowly, in quiet spaces, between graves and coffee cups and small acts of everyday kindness. It happened when grief recognized grief at the cemetery and chose to sit down beside it instead of walking past. It happened when Christmas no longer meant surviving the day alone, but sharing it with someone who understood. It happened in the way she listened to me talk about my parents, and in the way I listened when she spoke of Thomas. A fake engagement created the frame, but real trust and shared pain filled in the picture one brushstroke at a time. Our story turned out messy, imperfect, and unconventional, but that was also what made it undeniably ours. In the end, the unthinkable thing I did at table 12 became less of a stunt and more of a doorway we both chose to walk through. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that second chances can arrive in strange packaging, stay a little longer. Ask yourself whether there is a part of your life queuing quietly in the background, waiting for you to choose it at last. Maybe it is not a proposal in a crowded restaurant, but a conversation you have been avoiding for far too long. Maybe it is forgiving yourself for staying in a bad situation, or daring to believe you are not finished with love yet. If you have ever lived a moment that looked insane from the outside but made perfect sense in your heart, share it below. I would love to read your experiences, your twists of fate, and the risks you took when logic said you should stay seated. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more emotional, cinematic stories. Your support helps these narratives reach people who might need a reminder that their lives are not over at the first heartbreak. Leave a comment telling me which scene you felt the most, or whose shoes you imagined yourself standing in tonight. Because sometimes, one wild decision and a single word of courage are exactly what it takes to rewrite an entire life.